Here is Chapter 2 of The Egypt Game, being read by me, Miss DePoy. Enter April. Her name was April Hall, but she often called herself April Dawn. Exactly 1 month before the Egypt Game began in the professor's backyard, she had come, very reluctantly, to live in the shabby splendor of an old California Spanish apartment house called the Casa Rosada. She came because she'd been sent away by Dorothea, her beautiful and glamorous mother, to live with a grandmother she hardly knew, and who wore her gray hair in a bun on the back of her head. None of April and Dorothea's Hollywood friends ever had gray hair, except the kind you have on purpose, no matter how old they got otherwise. It had been on that very first day, early in August, that April and the professor first met. On that first morning of her new life, April had spent half an hour arranging her limp blonde hair in a high upsweep, such as Dorothea sometimes wore. It was hard work, much harder than it looked when Dorothea did it. As she pinned and repinned, April told herself with righteous bitterness that Caroline was sure to make her take it all down again anyway, and all her hard work would be for nothing. But if her grandmother noticed the hairdo, she said nothing about it at the breakfast table. She didn't even seem to notice how quiet and depressed April was and try to cheer her up with questions and conversation. April decided that Caroline must be the uninterested kind of person who didn't notice much of anything. Well, that was good, because for the short while she was here, April intended to go right on leading the kind of life she was used to, and if Caroline didn't even notice, well, at least there wouldn't be any trouble. All through breakfast, Caroline went on saying almost nothing, but finally, when she was almost through, she did say that she wouldn't mind being called Grandma, or even Granny, if April liked. "Oh, I guess I'll just go on calling you Caroline," April said, and then with pointed sweetness she added, "That is, unless you'd rather I didn't." Dorothea always called her Caroline instead of Mother, so what was wrong with Caroline instead of Grandmother? Of course, Caroline wasn't Dorothea's mother. She was the mother of April's father, who had died in an accident before April had even gotten a chance to know him. Nothing more was said until Caroline began to clear the table. Then she said, "I've arranged for you to have lunch with Mrs. Ross and her children on the second floor. She said she'd send Melanie, her little girl, up for you about 12 o'clock. The rest of the time, you'll be more or less on your own, but I'd appreciate it if you'd let Miss Ross know if you leave the building. Just tell her where you're going and how soon you'll be back." "I could get my own lunch," April said. "I cooked a lot at home." "I know," Caroline said, "but I've made this arrangement with Mrs. Ross, so we'll try it for a while, just till school starts. The Rosses are very nice people. Mrs. Ross teaches school, and her husband is a graduate student at the university. Their little girl is about your age, and they have a boy about 4. They're African Americans," she added. April shrugged. "Dorothy and I know a lot of black people. There are a lot of black people in show business." Caroline smiled. "I see," she said. "Tell me, April, what do you think of the Casa Rosada?" "The what?" April said. "The Casa Rosada, this apartment house." "Oh," April repeated her shrug. "It's okay." Actually, it had been a pleasant surprise, that is. It would have been if she'd been in the mood for pleasant surprises. The last time she'd visited Caroline, she'd lived in a tiny, super modern apartment, like a cell, only with paintings. The Casa Rosada was very different. Somehow it made April think of Hollywood and home. It was very Spanishy looking, with great thick walls, arched doorways, fancy iron grill work, stained glass panels in the windows, and tile floors in the lobby. Outside, it was painted pink. Caroline smiled her small, prim smile. "Mr. Ross calls it the petrified birthday cake, and I'm afraid that's a pretty good description. It must have been quite the thing when it was built back in the 20s. Of course, it's terribly run down now, but the apartments are roomy. It's so hard to find a modern place with 2 bedrooms that's not really expensive." It hadn't occurred to April that Caroline had moved because of her, so she could have a bedroom of her own. She knew she ought to feel grateful, but for some reason what she really felt was angry. What made Caroline think that April was going to be with her long enough for it to make any difference whether she had a room of her own or not? Dorothy had promised it would only be for a little while, only until things got more settled down and she wasn't on tour so much of the time. Before Caroline left, she wrote down the phone number of the library at the university where she worked, in case there was an emergency and April needed her. There wasn't much likelihood of that. April was used to taking care of herself. When she was alone, April went out on the tiny iron balcony and looked around. Caroline's apartment was on the 3rd and top floor and fronted on the avenue. Most of the buildings in the neighborhood were only 1 or 2 stories high, so from where she stood, she could get a pretty good idea of the lay of the land. On one side of the Casa Rosada were some small shops, a florist, a donut shop, and some others. On the other, across a narrow alley, was a tall billboard that pretty much blocked the view. But by leaning forward, April could see the facade of a long, low building. She could tell that it was very dingy, and the windows were badly in need of washing. From her position high and to one side, she couldn't make out the sign, but from the interesting clutter in the store windows, it seemed to be some sort of secondhand store. A store of that type always offered an interesting possibility for exploring, but April was really looking for something else at the moment. A drugstore might do, or perhaps a beauty shop. When Dorothy and Nick, Dorothy's agent and good friend, had put April on the bus the morning before, they had each slipped her some money. It added up to quite a bit, more than April was used to having all at once. She wanted to make some purchases before Caroline found out about it. Not that she really thought that Caroline would take the money away, but it would be just like a grandmother to insist that it be spent on something sensible, like new shoes or a school dress. A few minutes later, April was taking the old-fashioned elevator with its door like a folding iron fence down to the lobby. It wasn't until she was out on the sidewalk that she remembered what Caroline had said about reporting to Mrs. Ross before she left the building. She paused long enough to decide that reporting wouldn't be possible until that afternoon. After all, Caroline hadn't even told her where the Rosses lived, at least not exactly. With that settled to her satisfaction, she went up on the street. The girl in the drugstore looked surprised, but she didn't make too much of a big deal out of April's purchases. When she got out the false eyelashes, she did ask if they were to be a present for someone. But when April made her smile poisonously sweet and said, "Oh, no," she seemed to get the point and stopped asking questions. On the way home, April decided that since there was still plenty of time before 12 o'clock, she might as well explore the store she'd seen from the balcony. The store was called A to Z, and its dusty show windows were crammed with a weird clutter of old and exotic-looking objects. Huge bronze oriental vases next to some beat-up old pots and pans, an old-fashioned crank telephone, a primitive-looking wooden mask, and a treadle sewing machine. 2 kerosene lamps and a huge broad-bladed knife with a carved ivory handle. April felt a little tingle of excitement. She always felt that way about old stuff. It had been one of the few things that she and Dorothea didn't agree on. Dorothy always said, "I'll take mine new and shiny." It was dusky inside the store after the outdoor brightness. There didn't seem to be any clerks at all. Not that it mattered, because April was only looking. She squatted down in front of a glass case full of small objects, vases and jars, some partly cracked or broken, crudely made jewelry, and tiny statues. All of it looked terribly ancient and interesting. She was pressing her nose to the glass when suddenly she knew she was being watched. An old man was leaning over the counter right above her head. "Oh, hello," April said, and went on looking at a tiny statue with broad shoulders, short legs, and a hole in the top of its head. It almost looked Egyptian, and April had always been especially interested in Egyptian stuff. After a moment, she looked up again, and the man was still there. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the tiny figure. "That is a pre-Columbian burial figure. It was made in Mexico about 2,000 years ago." The old man's voice was slow and rusty. April looked up again quickly. 2,000? You're kidding," she said. But on second glance, she was sure he wasn't. He wasn't kidding, and he wasn't quite like anyone she'd ever seen before. He had a strange, skimpy-looking little beard, and his eyes were deep-set and as blank as an empty well. He said nothing more, and not by so much as a flicker did his face reveal what he was thinking. April was impressed. A deadpan was something she cultivated herself, and she knew from experience that such a perfect one was not easily come by. "I mean," she said with respectful caution, "is it really that old?" The old man tilted his stone face downward in a stiff nod. April went back to studying the objects in the case, but now her interest was divided. The old man was almost as unusual as the strange things behind the dusty glass. In a few moments, she stood up and smiled at him. It was a real smile, small and quick, not the gooey kind she usually used on grown-ups. Somehow she had a notion he wouldn't fool easily. "My name is April Hall," she said. "I've just come to live in the apartment house next door with my grandmother. I used to live in Hollywood with my mother." She paused. For a moment it looked as if the old man wasn't going to answer at all, but at last his craggy face cracked enough to allow the escape of two small words. "I see." April regarded him with grudging admiration. It usually wasn't very hard to pick the real meaning out of things people said, if you watched them closely. But this one wasn't going to be easy. The "I see" said nothing at all. It wasn't friendly or angry or curious or even bored. In fact, there was something about the absolute nothingness behind it that was a little bit frightening. Like putting out your hand to touch something that wasn't really there. April began to chatter a little nervously. "I'm a nut about things like that." She motioned towards the case. "I'm always reading about ancient times and stuff like that. You know, Babylonia and Egypt and Greece and China. It's kind of a hobby of mine. As a matter of fact, I'm even planning to be an archaeologist when I grow up. Some people think that's a pretty kooky ambition for a girl, but I like it. You see, I have this theory about how I was a high priestess once in an earlier reincarnation. Do you think that's possible?" "Possible?" The old man's voice quavered the word into a whole flock of syllables. "Many things are possible." "That's what I think too. A lot of people don't think so though. When I told Nick, he's my mother's agent, about the high priestess thing, he just laughed. He said, 'I don't know about those other reincarnations, kiddo, but in this one, you're a nut.'" Before the old man could answer, if he was going to, a couple of ladies breezed in the doorway. Of course, they interrupted right away when they saw that April was just a kid. As she drifted out the door and back to the Casa Rosada, April wondered why she gabbed so much. It wasn't really like her. She'd started out just trying to get the old man to talk, and then somehow she couldn't quit. It was almost as if the old man's deadly silence was a dangerous dark hole that had to be filled up quickly with lots of words. The end of chapter 2.